for the on behalf of InZone. So InZone, this university program offering academic courses to refugees wherever they live and wherever they are. And it's the second of this series. The talk is going to be in English, but there will be an interpretation in French. And to do so, you simply need to click on the globe symbol on your screen. I'll try to find it as well. And you will have real-time interpretation in French. You also have the possibility to ask questions at the end. So the format is very simple. We're going to have a 40 or 50-minute presentation by one of our professors, and then we will have a discussion with you, and you will be able to provide comments, but as well as questions. And to animate and facilitate this second webinar, we have the privilege to have Professor Laurent-Luchetti from the Geneva School of Economics and Management at University of Geneva, who is going to give us a course on the principles of economics, talking about inequality, climate change, and poverty reduction. And it's important for us. Economics is an important discipline in our society. I mean, you all know about, you all manage small scale projects or manage NGOs or CBOs, and of course, economics. You are, without awareness or not, dealing with a lot of the economic rule and theories. So we thought it would be very important to have one of the experts to talk about these principles and have a discussion with this expert. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you a lot, Carl. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm glad to be virtually with all of you here. So yes, this very short course is going to be a quick, very quick introduction to economics and modern economics. And what I will do is just give some recent facts, some description about economic growth, economic development in the world, highlighting two specific major challenges that we face as economists. First, it's the rise in inequalities between countries and within countries, and the climate change issues. So we're going to document economic growth over time, trying to understand some pillars of economic growth, and we will see that this economic growth, which came with benefits, also came with the costs, namely the rise in inequalities and climate change issues that will affect all of us now and in the future. If I have time, I will also mention at the end a small part on what economists do. So economists do not only describe and try to explain societies and the economy. We also sometimes provide policies, concrete policies, to try to solve some major issues. And here I will talk about one successful example, which is some policies that were targeted at reducing extreme poverty in some countries in the world. Okay, so if I have time. So first, three parts. The first part is going to be some descriptive. It's going to be a lot of description, trying to highlight facts and describe some major tools that we use in economics. And of course, I'm really happy to discuss them with all of you afterward. So I will define more precisely all of this, the terms that I will show on this slide and on the next one. So I will spend time describing all elements. But I just wanted first to highlight one of the, I think on this slide, it encapsulates most of what I will talk about. It's basically here on this graph. So on the horizontal axis, you have years, the last 200 years in the world. On the vertical axis, you have, think of it as income per capita in countries. Okay, it's a measure that economists use a lot, which is GDP. I will describe it later on. But think of GDP as being the income that is produced in a country in a given year. And GDP per capita is basically the average income in the country. And if we observe over time, we see that overall you have an increase in income per capita in the world. But first, we observe that this increase in income started at different times. So it started, for example, if you look at Europe and the United States, it started in the 19th century with industrialization. We'll talk about this process of, industrialization and growth. And the other, I think, salient thing that we can observe on this graph is very sharp inequalities between countries in terms of income per capita. We can observe three groups, the United States on top, then we can think of Europe as being the second group of countries in terms of income per capita, which is around 40,000 per inhabitants per capita. And then we have a last group of countries that for which growth kicked in more recently. So we try to explain what drives these inequalities. It's a major question for economists. What drive inequalities? What are the implications of inequalities and poverty? And then we will document the fact that this growth, mostly the growth in the richest countries, was accompanied by emission of CO2 that fostered climate change and will create damages for all of us. Okay. So another way to visualize these inequalities, I think, looking at a map is really enlightening. And what we see here is nightlight data from the NASA and nighttime luminosity. And what we know from economic studies is that this nighttime luminosity correlates extremely well with economic growth and economic development. And there is a very, very high correlation between these measures. And what we observe is, of course, that the richest country in the world, so we can think of North America, Europe, Japan, but also, China, India, we observe a sharp spatial inequalities over the world in terms of density of economic activities. Okay, so this is true, of course, between countries, but also within countries. If you look at China, the east side of the country is extremely well developed. Inland China, as we know, is less dynamic. Okay, so the kind of measures that we use in economics to measure poverty, inequalities, is basically, looking at what we call income, so GDP, as I will describe just after, and number of people below some threshold of income. So in order to compare countries, we compare living standards between, so in my example here, it's, for example, Ethiopia and Denmark. And the first thing that we do is that we compare incomes that are normalized across countries. So by normalize, I mean that, of course, I think you all know that with a certain sum of money, so for in this example, $30, you buy different things in Denmark than in Ethiopia, for example. So the first job of economists is, of course, to normalize this income, so that basically we ensure that with what we call international dollar, so that with $30 international in Ethiopia, you can buy exactly the same basket of goods as you would with $30 in Denmark. That being done, this normalization being done, we can compare the number of people that live with less than $30 per day in Denmark and in Ethiopia. And what we observe is that, for example, 86% of Denmark population is living with more than $30 per day, while in Ethiopia, this number is only 1%. So only 1% of the people live with more than $30 per day, of course, keeping in mind that it's normalized for prices. So access to goods, services, health, education, of course, all of that is conditioned by income availability and clearly matters for many dimensions of development. So keeping this measure in mind, if you look at the number of people for each country in the world living below this threshold of $30 per day, we observe, sorry, I will come back to this definition just after. We observe this graph here. So here on the horizontal axis, you have all countries in the world, and the weight of each bar is proportional to the population of the country. Okay, so we observe here India with a very large share of the world population, same for China. And on this horizon, on the vertical axis, we have the number of people that live below this $30 threshold. That is the threshold that is retained in many countries. And I mean here this international dollar. What we observe is that 77% of the world population live in a country in which more than 90% of the population live on less than $30 per day. Okay, and we see that in high-income countries, the within-country inequality tends to decrease drastically. Okay, so I think that this graph really encapsulates a lot of the major challenges that we face as economists, meaning that we have to face both a very high inequality within countries, but also a very high level of inequalities between countries. Okay, and part of our job as economists is trying to address these issues and try to reduce these inequalities while reducing the number of people living under these poverty lines. Okay. So I told you before that I had to, sorry, I had to come back a bit. I preempted a bit the discussion, but I wanted to define with you what we mean by GDP, this gross domestic product. So let me define that maybe in more formal term, because it's a measure that we will see a lot during this presentation. And basically, GDP is the income that is produced in a country a given year. Okay, it's the income, it's a measure of the market value of all final goods and services that are produced in an economy in a given year. Okay, so if you go and have an haircut, you pay the person. This is part of GDP. Okay, if you buy, of course, food to a farmer, then basically there is a transaction. This transaction is recorded and it's part of GDP. Okay, so basically think of it as the income that is generated in a country. Okay. Usually it's expressed in per capita terms, okay, as the average income. But of course, I'm sure you understand that GDP tells us how big the total income of the country is, but GDP per capita tells us how large each person's slice of the output is if everyone receives exactly the same amount. So GDP gives us no information on inequality, okay? Just give us an information on the average amount. So consider a group of people whose income is $1,000 per month. Of course, if half of the group has their income increased to $1,500 and the other half has their income reduced to $500, the average income is unchanged, but of course the living standards is totally different in these two countries, these two situations, okay? And of course income distribution affects well-being. Okay, so GDP is usually hiding a lot of different inequality measures, so keep that in mind. Okay, and this is exactly what I was trying to express in this graph, seeing that we have an increase in inequality both within and across countries. The last interesting piece of information on inequality is summarized on this graph. So we have a lot, it's kind of complex to read, so I will try to explain a bit how to read this graph. On this graph, and the objective of this graph is to show that inequalities are actually quite persistent over time. Okay? And let me explain how we can see that on this graph. On this horizontal axis, okay, we have the GDP per capita of all countries in the world in the 1960s. Okay, relative to the US, meaning that, for example, if you look at a country here, for example, Haiti, we know that in 1960, Haiti had a GDP per capita which was around 70% of the US. That's how you should read this graph. Okay. On the vertical axis, you have exactly the same measure, but 40 years after. in 2000. Okay, so it basically means that if a country is above the 45-degree line, so all these countries here above the 45-degree line, basically means that they grew faster than the US. Okay, all the countries below the line, basically they grew at a lower rate than the US. Okay, and somehow we would have liked to live in a world in which all countries would be above the 45-degree lines, meaning that all countries would have catch up somehow in terms of growth with the US. But we observe that it's not the case at all. Okay, most countries, we have some variance above and below the line, but we see that most countries are, lined up around this line, meaning that most countries did not specifically catch up with the US. We see that many countries actually below the line grew at a lower rate than the US over 40 years. Okay, and many reasons for that economists and political scientists, sociologists, and humanitarian try to explain. Okay, but we have very high persistence of inequalities over time. That's the bottom line. So very high inequalities across countries, within countries, very high inequalities that are persistent over time. And these are a set of questions that we need to address. So in order to understand these features, what we observe, economists provide models and models of economic growth, development, and we try to highlight the role of institutions, of the functioning of markets, etc., etc. So here, just provide one because it's a huge topic. So some history of economic growth, but very simplified, of very long trend. Basically, economists usually, very broadly, define, three big stages of development and about human development. If you look at, I think that most of the history of human activities were actually happening under what we call a Malthusian epoch, and I will define more precisely what we economists and historians mean by the Malthusian epoch. Then, starting from the 18th century, we had what we call the post-Malthusian epoch, so the kind of a kick-in of industry and an increase in economic growth. And we are living since, the last 150 years in modern growth regime. Okay? And if you take basically this human history in terms of time, and you look at the share of this time under which human societies were living with as the main mode of production as being, hunting and gathering, you can see that most of our history is actually happening under this growth regime of hunting and gathering. Okay, since let's say the last 14,000 years, we had the rise of agriculture, and agriculture became one of the dominant mode of production for most of our societies, up to the very recent last 150 years, in which basically industry and firms are driving, the modern growth, basically. So it's a really recent, what I want to highlight here is that it's a very recent piece of our history. So the Malthusian epoch, this, what happens up to the 18th century in most countries in the world, is basically an era that is defined by historians and economists, which main characteristic is that income per capita, or GDP per capita if you wish, does not grow, but it fluctuates around a subsistence level. So income was really low and was just sufficient to ensure reproduction of human societies. Okay, and this epoch characterizes most of human history. So it is considered as a period of economic stagnation. So here I don't mean cultural, of course, stagnation. I'm talking about purely economic stagnation with no or only little economic growth. Okay? Technological progress is really slow and increases in income per capita and increases in income per capita are channeled primarily into higher fertility. So each time that societies get richer, it means that population increase. Okay? So this growth regime means that every time that societies are richer, population expands. But the thing is that population growth would push down incomes as a result of diminishing average product of labor. We have less food, basically. So, income increase, population increase, we have less food, living standards decrease, and we have a lower population growth. So ultimately, incomes in this regime settle at the subsistence level. And this is a level of income where the population remains constant over time. Okay, so this is what has been documented by historians. And then what happened, especially in the UK in the 18th century, and then in Europe and in the US, and then in the rest of the world, is the takeoff from this Malthusian equilibrium, in which basically technological progress accelerated, meaning that income per capita increased, it affected population growth, but technological progress generated a larger increase in output than in population. So basically, incomes increased at a higher rate than population. Okay, it's one of the main characteristics of the takeoff from this Malthusian equilibrium. We had an increase in per capita income, and this increase is the first graph that I show you, GDP per capita. Faster growth of income per capita and population led to the recent trends that we observe. So if you look at England, because it's the first country historically that experienced this takeoff from this Malthusian equilibrium, if you look at GDP per capita in the UK, starting from middle age, you see that, as I mentioned, GDP per capita was really low and really stable over time. So it's the Malthusian regime. And then, boom, we have an increase and then a very sharp increase in income in the UK. What we can see is that growing income, of course, is associated with many other benefits because, of course, richer societies can pay for more education, more health, etc., etc. So you had a sharp increase in food supply per capita in the UK over the same period. Okay, so the number of calories that was produced and available to each citizen increased tremendously. It was associated with an increase in life expectancy, okay, starting from 40 years up to the recent 80 years, okay. Sharp decrease in child mortality for the most recent data we have. Increase in the average year of schooling of everybody in the country, starting from 10 months in the 19th century to almost 13 years nowadays. And of course, a sharp increase in literacy rates. Of course, it was extremely gender unbalanced at the beginning of the process, but happily in more modern histories, these rates converged. So basically, economic growth and growth of societies was associated with ample advances in health, in education, that allowed the whole country to improve, not only on economic grounds, but also on social ground and lowering discrimination, among other benefits. So that's the benefits part of economic growth. It comes with benefits, but with a cost, and I highlight that just after. So the huge number of scientific and technological advances coincided with this upward kink in the hockey stick, as we call it, in Britain in the middle of the 18th century. And it was driven by these new technologies that emerged in textile, energy, and transportation. Okay? This period of cumulative innovation, we call it the Industrial Revolution. So if we look at a graph, I won't spend too much time in detailing it, but if you look at the graph, here it's the GDP of the UK and United States, in which basically we mention the appearance of each major invention, starting from the steam engines that started it all, okay, with, you know, spinning mill, the first railway, okay, mechanical harvesting, transcontinental railroad in the US and in the United Kingdom, and the creation of, by Henry Ford, of the first assembly line, which, you know, just pushed up industry. And you see that we, with each of these industrial progress, we have an increase of income per capita that just accompanies these cumulative innovations. And each time, this increase in GDP per capita was associated with increase in health, education, decrease in mortality rate, increase in literacy rates. Everything was fostered together. Okay, so this is basically a very simple graph of these modern economies, in which basically we started with, you know, think of an economic system with private property, sorry, so we can think of self-sufficient family-based production, so farm households usually. Then basically we can think of this family-based production in which you have markets, so households can exchange with each other, their surplus of production. And modern capitalist economic system are the same, but with firms on top, meaning that now you have institutions, firms that are specialized in production, hire labor, give wages in exchange, and basically organize themselves on markets. Okay, and most of modern economies are organized along this modern growth regime. Okay, so what we know is that modern economies are dynamic when basically three pillars are present. You need a well-functioning legal system and a system in which government provides essential goods and services, so health, education, infrastructure, security. All of that is provided by the state. Firms are not controlled by people because of government connection or privilege by birth. Okay, and market, firms, and states are all regulated by laws and policies. So these three pillars are essential for ensuring this economic growth that I just described before. The rule of law and protection of individual people is essential. So the last thing I wanted to mention with respect to growth and its benefits before moving to you know, the issues we face with growth is that, as I mentioned, growth allows to finance public services, public goods, like health, education, but not only. And it allows people, of course, to expand their capabilities and certainly offers more freedom. An interesting fact is that actually GDP per capita, so income in the average income per capita in all countries in the world, correlates extremely well with many measures of self-reported life satisfaction. Okay, this data is gathered by the World Bank in each year on representative members of citizens of each country. And what we observe on this axis is the average life satisfaction, okay, in countries. And basically this life satisfaction is measured from 1 to 10, okay, where 10 is the highest possible life satisfaction that you can report. And on this axis, we have GDP per capita. And we see a clear positive correlation between access to income, access to health, access to education, and life satisfaction. Okay, so it's not only access to material goods, it's also access to freedom, to capabilities that are enhanced by income and growth, basically. Okay, of course, you have some high variance. Some countries are rich, but are relatively rich, but not that happy. And to the contrary, some countries are not that rich, but really happy, and happily, I want to say. Okay, money is not everything. but it matters for public goods. Okay, so of course there is a dark side to all that, and I will just mention one dimension, but many others are present. But let's say one salient issues with modern economic growth is inequality, the first thing I mentioned. So it creates inequality. So we can find that repulsive. Another issues which I think is more visible is of course pollution and climate change. GDP and the income measures that I use up to now is notorious for not accounting for the depletion of natural resources that it creates or it uses. Okay, so the failure to count the depletion of our natural surroundings can make a big difference in our assessment of average living standards. Okay, so just to give you an example, a well-known example, if you look, for example, at Indonesian GDP, okay, in the period in which the Indonesian GDP took off between the 70s and middle of the 80s, the annual rate of growth was 7.8%. So it's quite high increase in their income. However, if the depletion of petroleum reserve, forest, and soil were taken into account, then it would have been 4% only. And actually, if we accounted for the cost in terms of climate change, this number would be even lower. Okay, so in a way, what we need to do is not only look at GDP that we know, because it's a very incomplete measure. We also need to look at all the damages that are, or the resources that are used and uncounted in GDP. Okay, so the economy we know is embedded into larger societies. So we are the economic system is embedded in larger societies with institutions, government, NGOs. All of that is surrounding our economic activities. But all of us, of course, are included in the biosphere and our physical environment. The economy is just a small part of that. We are embedded in larger structure. Okay, and if we wanted to present the simplest economic model you can think of, it would be this one. Basically, we're going to have household, it's us, okay? And we're going to have firms for which we work, most of us, okay? And the households, we provide labor to firms, and firms provide goods and services to us in exchange through wages that allows us to pay, okay? We pay taxes to the government, and the firm pay taxes to the government, and in exchange, the government provide law and public services, health and education, among others. And the government provide also law and public services to firms through infrastructure, contractual enforcement. All of that allows firms to operate. So that's the economic system in very simple terms. But of course, as I said, we are embedded into larger biosphere and physical environment, meaning that we basically use resources, land, soil, mineral, energy, air, and water. All of that, we use that to produce, to consume. And in exchange, we send back pollution. Okay, so we both exhaust some resources and we add pollution to the system. Okay, and if you look, for example, let me maybe just move that. If you look here, when you here on the graph on the left, you have the increase in GDP that I mentioned from the beginning. Okay. You have the increase in GDP starting in 18th century, 19th century. And of course, it correlates incredibly well with CO2 emissions because, of course, as you saw on my innovation graph, most of this increase in GDP started with a steam machine and coal machine, meaning that most of our modern growth was based on the use of fossil fuel that emits a lot of CO2. And of course, CO2 concentration, as we know from scientists, correlates with increase in temperature. And this increase in temperature will feed back to our societies through climate damages. So it will create economic costs and societal costs that we have to somehow to anticipate and we have to account for them. So a big part of our job as economists is trying to anticipate what will be the cost of climate change in order first to understand by to motivate the reducing CO2 emissions, but also to anticipate what will happen. Okay. So if we think of an increase of 2 degrees in temperature, and sadly it's more or less what we are lined up for such an increase at the moment, it means falling crop yields in many areas, particularly in developing regions. Okay. Water supply will be threatened in many areas. Okay. We're going to have a decrease in water availability. We're going to have, of course, some damages on ecosystem. We're going to have an increase in extreme weather events, some things that we already start seeing. And basically, we will also start seeing a risk of abrupt and major irreversible changes. Okay, something that is more uncertain, but start to get well understood. So all of that will have high cost for societies. If you look at emissions, per capita CO2 emissions recently, of course, you see that these emissions are concentrated. Okay, not all countries are equally responsible for CO2 emissions. So we see that there is a concentration in emissions in North America, in oil and gas producing countries such as Russia, for example. And then you have Europe, China, Australia as being the main emitters. But of course, the thing with climate change is that, as you know, certainly, the damages of climate change do not correlate with who emits CO2. So the countries that emit the most the CO2 won't be the countries that will suffer the most from climate change. And this is the last piece of information that I will present, and then I will open the discussion. It's actually this graph showing that the impact of climate change are expected to be highly unequal. So once again, I want to highlight that inequality and climate change are related. So on the horizontal axis, we have once again GDP per capita. So richer countries are located on the right and poorer countries are located on the left. On the vertical axis, we have basically variation in temperature. So expected variation in temperature. What does it mean? It means that all countries that are on top of the line are expected to have to experience more climate change than the average, to put it simply. All countries below the line are actually expected to have less climate change, lower variability in temperature. And we think of variability in temperature as being very, very detrimental for societies. What we see is that we observe a negative correlation, meaning that these countries that are poorer nowadays are also the ones that will certainly experience higher, more stark climate change, while countries that are richer nowadays, so that are most responsible for climate change in terms of CO2 emission, will also be the ones that suffer less from climate change. Okay? So with the opening of the COP28 in 2 days, I think it's a well-known fact, but sadly, linking inequality and climate change, it's still not something that is at the forefront of the discussion, while I think it's really one of the main salient issues we are facing. Okay? So here are some facts that we address as economists, trying to understand development and growth, the role of institutions, the role of market, of health, education, trying to understand inequalities, how to reduce inequalities, how to reduce poverty, and trying to understand some other big challenges like pollution, climate change, and their implication. Okay? I do not have time to go into more detail, but you should know that we also, as economists, we also try, of course, to act, to propose solution policies to reduce poverty, to address issues such as climate change and inequalities. And some of these policies are developed by many economists around the world. So I thank you all for your attention, and I'm open to question now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Let's open the floor now for discussion. Very much free to ask questions and make comments. So please use the function on the Zoom. or you raise your hand. If I can see you, then I can also give you the floor. So and as well for all our students, it's a fantastic illustration how data can be presented. And you've seen, Jeremy has every time there's a graph, every time there is a figure presented, there's always a reference. There's always the source of information, always a date, always a unit of analysis. That's important for you in your studies, and this is what we expect from you as well when you work your essays on your exams. And so we had a beautiful illustration on how to do it. Please let me have a look, and so I can see everybody. Please do not hesitate to raise your hand or use your Q&A, as I said. Yes, we've got a couple of people. We've got Inusa Mamansanda. Please open your microphone and we try to answer your question. And then we will have Almarat. One of you, if you want to take the floor, you're absolutely free to do so.
Yes, hello.
Yes.
Yes, the microphone was closed. Okay, yeah, my name is Almarat. I'm from Kenya, specifically from Kakuma. And yes, I think as you've said, the topic has been, let me say, very interesting, and I have a number of questions. But let me try to be fast. Okay, the first one is, of course, on the role of economies. I think you've said very well, try to shape policies that actually address some of these inequalities. But from my own, let me say, understanding, I came to note sometimes, I don't know, do we have biased economists? That means they let me say, their advice, or it's kind of controlled by, let me say, some other factors, maybe powerful people who lead them to actually not make the right, advice that will shape policy in some way or the other. Maybe you can tell me that and some of its consequences. And then the second one is on the method you've used on actually calculating the actually living standards. I think you've used GDP and then narrow it down to per capita, which, if I'm not wrong, is actually GDP divided by the number of population in a country. But I don't know, as well from my own studies, sometimes this does not give a true reflection. This is because, for example, in countries where wealth is concentrated in few hands of people. So, for example, let me say, rich countries, for example, let me say in United States, whereby, we have a lot of number of billionaires, or maybe in Africa, whereby, of course, because of a lack of just, good, fair legal system, some people accumulate, a lot of wealth, not, in a fair way. So let's assume sometime, that wealth is redistributed among the population. Sometimes you have people don't have anything, but because of the redistribution, of course, it raises the number of people who actually have, let me say, for example, living above $30 a day, which I think sometimes. So maybe you can address that, and then.
Thank you, Almarat. Let's start with that.
Okay, thank
it's
you.
a lot already. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Almarat. It's a very good point. The first point is about what kind of policy should we put into place, a lot of them. Something that I did not have time to mention, but I can talk about it briefly now, is the fact that it's very important to implement policies that are based on scientific evidence. So what works, in a way, we need to implement things that works really to help people that are the poorest in the society, or trying to favor industry instead of what pleases. You know what pleases, for example, some local decision makers that do not have, sometimes the best interest of the population at heart. So it should be based on scientific evidence, and I think it's the most important thing. and it should be based on policies that really works. Okay. And some economists, so for example, it started with Nobel Prize winner Esther Duflo, tried to develop some huge wealth of scientific evidence and development that really, I think, ground some sound economic policies in most countries in the world. So yes, I totally agree with you. To avoid bias, we should ground ourselves on scientific evidence and evidence-based policy. The other part of your question that is also very interesting, I totally agree with you, is that GDP per capita is just GDP divided by a number of inhabitants. And exactly as you mentioned, it does not reflect inequality within countries. So the fact that, for example, most of the resources can be concentrated in the hands of few people in some societies. Okay, I totally agree with you, and it's one of the main limitations of this measure. So that's why usually income and GDP per capita should be coupled with a form of redistribution in order to increase welfare in a country. And redistribution can be done through construction of schools, health, infrastructures, but also direct redistribution of resources within a country. And this measure of redistribution, coupled with income generation, usually lead to higher average welfare. But you are totally right. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you very much. There's also, Komi just wrote something about difference between, or the similarities between India and Ethiopia. And
so basically your question is, if I interpret it correctly, is how can we interpret the difference in GDP between India and Ethiopia, and what economists do in trying to explain this difference? So actually, your question is also a very interesting question. It's something we do a lot as economists, but also political scientists do that. It's trying to understand what we do is meaning comparative politics, meaning trying to understand what are the difference between two countries and what can drive their difference in GDP. Okay, so for example, both India and Ethiopia are countries with a high share of in which agricultural production represents a high share of GDPs, organized around slightly different institutions, with household farmers in Ethiopia, but with landowners and daily laborers in India, and actually trying to understand how all this institutional arrangement, so how production is working, what is the role of the state, what is the role of a risk of conflict, for example, that has more salient in Ethiopia, for example, than in India. All of that might impact economic growth, development, and inequalities. So the role of economists are actually trying to understand what are the differences between these countries and why one might grow faster than the other one while they have similar economic conditions to start with. Okay, so you're totally right. It's one of our job to do that.
Excellent. Amici, Amici, do you want to open your microphone and ask your questions or make your comments?
Yes, Amici, you can open your microphone if you wish, clicking on it, and we listen to you here, like we did with Almarat.
Allô?
Yes, we hear you, Amici.
Merci de m'avoir donné la parole. Ma question va s'articuler autour de la réduction de la pauvreté dont vous avez parlé. Mais moi, je pense que ici en Afrique, nous constatons que au moment où vous pensez développer des politiques pour réduire la pauvreté, en même temps, vous développez des guerres. Mais moi, je trouve que ce que vous avez dit là, c'est peut-être vouloir soutenir une chose et son contraire à la fois. C'est là où je ne comprends pas. Merci.
Okay, thank you for the question, Amici. So I'm trying to understand. So you say you basically disagree with the policies that we push. I'm sorry. I think. Can you maybe repeat the questions? Oui, on peut parler en français à Missy aussi, si vous voulez. J'essaye de comprendre si vous pouvez répéter la question, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Je vais répéter la question.
Oui,
Moi, je me suis intéressé là où vous avez dit que vous avez des mesures pour réduire la pauvreté et peut-être réduire les effets du réchauffement climatique.
OK.
Ma question se pose à ce niveau. Comment, je ne comprends pas ou je ne comprends pas très bien comment vous pensez réduire la pauvreté et en même temps vous développer des guerres en Afrique. Moi, je pense que vous êtes en train de soutenir une chose et son contraire à la fois. C'est ça ma question.
Okay. Merci, Amici. Thank you a lot. It's more clear for me, and thank you. Now I understand better. I think you're certainly referring to the fact that economic growth is important to get out of poverty and development issues, but at the same time, economic growth creates climate change, which, for example, will have impact in many countries, but especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and might actually trigger conflict. And in that, you're totally right. And I think it's one of the major challenges that we are facing is how can we bring countries out of poverty through economic growth while limiting the effect it has on climate change that will itself create conflict and many issues in sub-Saharan Africa. You're totally right. It's one of the main challenges that we face as modern societies, and it's still an open question.
Thank you. Merci, Amici. We've got another question about VNA, who explained there's a paradox between in which countries where we've got economic income increases as population decreases. How do we explain that?
It's a very good question. So it's actually the answer is coming from, it's not I'm not a specialist of this question, but many economists work with demographers, so people living on population, explaining population dynamics, explaining why we observe these patterns. And what demographers tells us is that the decrease in child mortality and the increase in life expectancy correlate with a decrease in number of child per household, per mother. Okay, so as income grow, basically, as income grow, you have more and more health services, education services, and you have an increase in life expectancy, a decrease in child mortality, and a decrease in the number of child per mother that is associated.
Thank you, Jeremy. And then we've got a question from Sarah. Maybe you can take the floor, Sarah. You have written your question. It's always nice to hear you on the online. Sarah Aker, do you want to take the floor? So you're just making a comment about mining activities and saying that it's highly polluting, and as well, so this kind of living actually is linked to poverty as well, and then trying to make sense of the contradiction we have in some sub-Saharan African countries, and trying to make sense of that.
It's also, I think it's a thank you, Sarah, for it's also a very, very relevant question. It's linked, I think, to the point raised by Amici just before, meaning that there is a contradiction between modern economic growth that use a lot of resources, fossil fuel, but also minerals, and the pollution and the damages it creates on the environment that feeds back on development. And finding a balance between livelihood of person working in mines, artisanal mines, for example, in Africa, but not only, also industrial mines, and the need for minerals that is needed to foster the technologies that will replace fossil fuel. We can think of solar panels, battery. All of that will also create damages on the environment, and we need to account for them because otherwise we will end up in a new problem which will be related to mining more than fossil fuel and climate change. And you are totally right. I think there is economic growth, use resources, and use and pollute, and it feeds back on our society in a very negative manner. And we need to seriously address this issue while we think of developing. Otherwise, we will end up in new major issues in the next century. So it is at the forefront of the issues we want to address, but it's a very complicated problem. And I think you point that out very well. So thank you, Sarah, and also Amici for previous question.
Thank you very much. And then just a quick comment coming from a health perspective. We have seen during the pandemic, what I just want to say that poverty is not exclusive to low-income countries. You have seen during the pandemic probably images in Europe of people going to food banks, and as well you have seen images of homeless people in Europe, where we are seeing more and more in very rich countries and following this capitalism approach, is that inequalities and inequities are increasing more and more in Europe. And you know about this figure, about 1% of the richest have the largest portion of wealth in the world. And so what Jeremy is trying to explain is that not only there are differences between countries, but as well within countries, but as well within rich countries. And that's important as well. This is what we're trying to address as well in the health system in many countries, including in Switzerland, where we live now, and in France, in neighboring countries. A lot of organizations, economists, but as well health experts are trying to reduce these inequities, access to healthcare, access to education, but as well how to make sure that income as well can be sustained with a lot of social safety nets, for example. And so we in some of the countries there are some insurances, but you have seen that as well in Kenya, in Jordan, in other countries where a lot of health insurance schemes are put in place by the government or by UNHCR and other organizations. So what we have heard today is very relevant to many settings and many contexts. And when Jeremy is talking and presenting all these theories of economics, we also need to relate that to the context where we live and where we work. And that's also relevant to Geneva and to Switzerland. Any other intervention? Please do not hesitate to raise your hands. We've got a few more minutes. Inusa.
Yep, it's a very interesting question. So maybe I can read it if you don't mind, Carl. It's basically about Inusa raised the question of what are the measures that we can take to transfer monies towards the countries that are not responsible for climate change because they did not emit CO2 in the past, but are the main victims of climate change. So these countries that are above the line I presented before. I think it's when I said that climate change and inequalities are interlinked issues, and I said that we should address that as a priority, this is the essence, I think, of your remark, is that countries that will suffer for climate change are not responsible for it. It has been estimated by economists, Esther Duflo among others, that rich, high-income countries should transfer the equivalent of at least 500 billions towards the poorest countries that will suffer climate change in order to compensate, start compensating for this biased responsibility. So the answer to your question is that the amount of money that needs to be transferred is in the order of magnitude of 500 to 600 billions, which is, as most people work in humanitarian action know, is a very high number. And it has been agreed in the Copenhagen COP in 2018 that rich countries were indeed responsible and should, in principle, transfer money towards the victim of climate change, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, that are not responsible for climate change. It has been agreed on the principle, but nothing has been done yet. And to be fair with you, I'm not very hopeful for what will happen in the COP on Friday in Riyadh. But in the Middle East, sorry. I'm not hopeful that any transfer will be agreed upon. But maybe I might be proved wrong. Okay. So it's a very good point. I totally agree with you. I think most economists agree with you. But politically, it's a very sensitive issue given the amount of money that needs to be transferred.
And then there's another question from Pham, who was talking about the stages of developments. So probably you could explain a little bit what we mean by stages of developments, and maybe different models as well of economic growth, because many regions have evolved in different ways.
Thank you for this question. So about which stage of development will make the economic grow faster? Well, to be fair, I would love to be able to answer this question in 2 minutes, but because it's one of the fundamental questions that economists think about, model of growth, and how can we categorize different model of growth, and which one is more successful. Sadly, I think I won't have time, but I can come back to maybe the 3 pillars that I highlighted at a point that makes most economies grow faster, and it's basically rely on well-functioning government, in the sense that government are at the service of the citizens. There is a rule of law, meaning that both governments, any citizen are equal in front of the law, and government provide public services. So tax citizens and firms on one hand, but provide public services on the other hand that more than compensate for the taxes that are taken in the first place. And we can think of health, education, and economists try to highlight which of these infrastructure are the best for societies and economic growth. And the ranking is clear. Education is up there. If you invest on education, then societies grow faster. It's one of the best return on dollars spent that you can have. Education first, health, of course, and infrastructures like road transportation, networks also matters a lot. Of course, but it's not the only thing. Many other things matter, but sadly, I don't have time.
Almarat, again, you want to take the floor? And then we've got another question from Rabiu.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mine is on GDP growing proportional with population growth. I don't know. I thought probably because when the population grows, there's more. Let me say, market for goods and services. But I don't know if that's true, or if population growth, that does not necessarily mean GDP or economy will grow.
It's a good point. Actually, it goes both ways, in the sense that population growth, of course, with higher level of population, you have more workers, more consumers, meaning that mechanically GDP increase. But the thing is that with higher population, you also have more pressure on resources. Think of crowded cities, more pressure on water, more pressure on energy, and that tends to decrease economic growth as well. Okay, so higher population mechanically increase economic activity, but it comes with a cost that usually tends to decrease GDP per capita. That's why what we observe is that with economic growth, we tend, and it was a question we had just before, we tend to see a decrease in population increase, in the number of child per inhabitants. So we observe this U-shape, inverted U-shape graph, in which with economic growth you have an increase in population in the first stage of growth, and then at a point it starts to decrease. This is what we observe in most countries.
Thank you, Rabiu. Oh, that's a big question, and maybe that could be the end, because that's the key question for Jeremy.
Thank you a lot, Vianney. So the question by Vianney is, what is your suggested solution to this unstoppable economic inequality, especially to the south, blessed with enough natural resources? So I think here there is two sources of inequalities we need to address. The first one is within country inequalities. So the fact that rich inhabitants in a country tend to concentrate more of the resources. Here within a country, the best tool we have, as I mentioned before, is redistribution of money from the rich to the poor toward investment in infrastructure. So the state plays a key role here in trying to take more of the resources in the richest member of the society to invest in public infrastructure that benefits all inhabitants. And I mentioned education, but not only. Okay, so within country, it's a clear and efficient way to reduce inequalities and reduce poverties. Between countries, the question is a bit more difficult because we have no institution that can tax rich country to redistribute money toward. That we cannot force countries to do that, and it should be based on consensual agreement. And I think that humanitarian aid is one way to do it, but IMF, it's usually. You lend money to countries as long as countries follow some rules. But I think that it helps, and I think the World Bank also plays a role here, a key role. But by most economists think that these transfers are not sufficient to reduce inequalities efficiently. As I mentioned, inequalities are extremely persistent over time, and no policies that we put into place up to now allow the reduction in inequalities between countries.
Thank you very much. And in health, we have to reduce inequities within countries. We have this in health economics. We have this principle of what we call risk pooling. So the most inequitable system in health is that every individual, you, me, and so on, is going to directly pay for health services every time you want to see a doctor, for example. Why? Because myself, I will pay $20, and one of you will pay $20. Maybe if there are differences in terms of salary, the $20 is not going to have the same value for you and for me and for others or for my neighbors and so on. Okay, so one way of doing that is what Jeremy explained as well, but we call that the risk pooling, which is the insurance. When we talk about insurance, we talk about national health insurance systems, for example. And it does mean that the people who are the sickest in society could benefit at the same level as any other person, whatever the income, to the same level of care, the same quality of care. So within countries, there are some mechanisms that can help reduce inequities in terms of income, but as well in terms of access to basic services. And that could be education as well. And sometimes many services are subsidized by the state. And then, so Inusa, you have a question about why not to invest in education. So that's an excellent question.
So why not to invest in education? I don't know, because it's an obvious thing to do. As I said, I think it's one of the largest consensus you might find among economists, is that education is one of the best investment you can do as a society. So if you think of highest return, meaning $1 that you invest in a public service, how much it benefits society, it's certainly one of the highest return you can obtain. So, yes, it's an excellent question. Why do we not invest enough in education? I don't know why, to be fair with you. There is many political reasons for that, I'm sure, and many political issues, but it's the best investment we can do. So I totally agree with you. We need to do it more.
And I really invite you to look at, in your respective countries or your countries of origin, go back to the statistics and look and search. That could be your homework for next time, is to look at the level of spending by your respective governments in each of the different sectors. And you will realize that education is one of the less invested sector everywhere in the world. And health, we are a bit more, we are luckier in that side that there's more investment. But you will see that it's nothing considered to other sectors. It could be the police, it could be the military, it could be other sectors. So I will invite you to go back to the statistics, to build some pie chart, and to really understand where money is invested in your countries of origin. It is fascinating to look at that. Right. There's no other questions. I think it's a natural end. I would like to thank you for attending this webinar. Also would like to thank Shafia and Sophie to deliver a fantastic service, which is a luxury for many universities in the world, to have professional interpreters to do this work, so that this lecture can be available in English and in French. And I also want to thank Professor Laurent-Luchetti for giving his time and to answer all your questions. This lecture will be has been recorded and will be available on the InZone website, so you can go back to it. And I hope that we have inspired you to explore more and more and read more about these topics of economics, which is fascinating because it's everywhere, everywhere in society. It guides many decisions that are made by entrepreneurs, but as well by politicians. So I really encourage you to go more in depth into this topic and to read more. Do not hesitate to go on the Coursera catalog, because there are plenty of courses as well available. And we hope that we can at InZone actually explore more and more and adapt this topic to your own needs in terms of small-scale projects and bring some of the theories into our courses. Thank you very much for attending this webinar, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.